Hello, I'm Charlotte Slark and I'm a collaborative doctoral partnership funded PhD researcher at Queen Mary University London in the V&A Museum of Childhood. My research looks at the social history of the V&A Museum of Childhood in Bethnal Green from its designation as the Museum of Childhood in 1974 to about 2010 or so. But I'll be talking to you about a particular moment in the museum's history today, the 1982 campaign to save the museum from closure, with a particular focus on the involvement of children in the campaign. Despite being part of the V&A, arguably one of Britain's most influential national museums, very little has actually been written about the Museum of Childhood's history. There are two reasons why this is the case. One, the museum's location in the East End of London, a site which has historically been very working class and home to various immigrant groups. And two, the fact that it is a museum that focuses on the history of childhood, two things that have historically been looked upon with snobbish derision. The story of the Museum of Childhood's threat of closure is part of a wider story of the V&A, and as such is often only vaguely referred to, and when it is, the involvement of children in the campaign to save the museum is never mentioned at all. I'm going to start by giving you a brief explanation of why the Museum of Childhood was even threatened with closure in the first place, before going on to look at the campaign to save the museum and how children were involved in ultimately keeping the museum open. I am then going to look at how children are often left out of the story, and why this might be the case. The Museum of Childhood started life as the Bethnal Green Museum in 1872, before being rebranded as the Museum of Childhood in 1974. Since then, it's been referred to by a whole host of names, internally, externally, and even officially, including, but not limited to, the Bethnal Green Museum, the Bethnal Green Museum of Childhood, V&A Museum of Childhood, National Museum of Childhood, or just the Museum of Childhood. For clarity, I'm going to be referring to the museum as the Museum of Childhood throughout, unless I'm specifically talking about it in a pre-1974 context. In order to explain why the Museum of Childhood was threatened with closure in the early 1980s, it's important to understand how both it and its parent museum, the main V&A in South Kensington, came to be. The V&A started off life as a South Kensington museum, which had developed from the Great Exhibition of 1851. When the South Kensington Museum was created, the Governmental Department for Practical Arts was created in order to administer it. A science division was added in 1853, changing the administering body to the Department of Science and Art, which was then taken over by the Education Department in 1856. This meant that unlike most other national museums, the V&A and its outstations, such as the Museum of Childhood, was run by the civil service rather than by trustees. So why is this important? Because it meant that the V&A, and as an extension the Museum of Childhood, was subject to any government-imposed civil service cuts. For example, when Harold Wilson's government imposed 11% staff cuts on the civil service in 1976, the V&A had to cut roughly 80 people. The Museum of Childhood came out of that round of cuts relatively unscathed, but the next big government intervention would threaten their very existence. Just after Thatcher's election as Prime Minister in 1979, a group called the Efficiency Unit was established to examine ways to save money throughout governmental departments, especially the civil service. The Efficiency Unit was initially headed by Derek Rayner, who, in true Thatcherite style, came from a business background. Rayner had formerly been Joint Managing Director of Marks & Spencer before joining Thatcher's Conservative government mid-days after her election. Rayner, along with his Chief of Staff, developed a review process which came to be known as scrutinies. In 1981, the museums under civil service control, so the V&A and also the Science Museum, became the focus of Rayner's team, the so-called Rayner's Raiders. The Rayner scrutiny of the departmental museums, Science Museum and Victoria and Albert Museum, was written by the retired civil servant Frederick Gordon Burrett and was published in May 1982. The report made many recommendations on how the running of the V&A could be more cost-effective, including the introduction of a more managerial culture. Recommendation number 28 of the report refers directly to the Museum of Childhood, stating that admission charges should be introduced at the Museum of Childhood, Bethnal Green, with a view to securing net income, which would cover the museum's true recurrent costs. If that proves impossible, consideration should be given to closing it down. In other words, the Museum of Childhood should become completely self-financing, or close for good. This was completely without precedent, and this suggestion that a museum should be run along the same principles as private business was a revolutionary and controversial one. There was backlash in the press against this idea of national museums being encouraged to run along what one reporter called department store lines and to accept, quote, the philosophy of the high street. But it was not just an ideological issue. This recommendation would be tantamount to a death sentence for the Museum of Childhood. In order to raise the money needed to run, the Museum of Childhood would need to charge an entrance fee that many of their regular visitors couldn't afford. If admission charges were introduced, the visitor numbers would fall, and the museum would never earn enough money to stay open. If Recommendation 28 was to be pursued, the museum would inevitably close. It's important to acknowledge that one of the reasons which the Rainers Raiders had given for this recommendation was that they did not consider the subject matter of the Museum of Childhood to be important enough. The report states that we do not think that a special museum devoted in this case to the culture of childhood should be very high on the parent museum's list of priorities, or that curatorially speaking, its field has the widely recognised importance of those covered by most of the departments at South Kensington. If the Bethnal Green collections were to be reabsorbed by those departments, the loss would be more to public pleasure than to essential knowledge and scholarship. A consultation period, lasting until August the same year, was set up by the Minister for the Arts, Paul Channon, and the Museum of Childhood staff set to mobilising various networks in order to lobby the Minister to keep the museum open and fee-free. The box file in the Museum of Childhood archive holds examples of letters and petitions campaigning on behalf of the Museum of Childhood, which gives a good overview of the broad range of networks which the Museum of Childhood staff reached out to. The file contained letters from education professionals, businesses, many of whom had been original subscribers of the Bethnal Green Museum, media and commerce professionals, MPs, local people and the general public. It also contains a large quantity of letters from children. Now these are really interesting, so if you want to pause the recording at any point to give yourself a chance to read them properly, please go ahead. The over 100 letters were all sent to the Museum of Childhood's director, Anthony Burton, via 4 different schools, and all appear to have been written as an in-class activity. All are from primary school children, so all under the age of 11, and it's interesting that none are from schools in the immediate vicinity of the museum, but are instead from outer London boroughs or counties that are within an hour or so's coach ride from the Museum of Childhood. All of the children had previously visited the museum as part of a school trip, with many of their visits occurring not long before they wrote their letters. The letters that appear in the Museum of Childhood archives are all photocopies of originals. I don't have a concrete answer why this is the case, but I do have 2 reasonable theories. Either the museum sent the originals to Paul Channon and kept photocopies for their records, or the school had sent photocopies and retained the originals as records of their students' work, perhaps in order to grade them. The first theory seems reasonably convincing until you see that the rest of the box file does contain original copies of petitions and letters from businesses and other adult supporters. And while the second begs the question of why all 4 schools had each decided to send copies, it does raise some important questions about the reasons behind the letters' creation. Were they purely a mode of protest, or were they also a learning activity? There are no teachers' cover notes present in the archives. This doesn't, of course, mean that they didn't exist, just that they weren't kept. So we know very little about how these letters came to be. We do know that the learning department had reached out to their contacts, asking them to provide support for the museum, but as far as I've been able to ascertain, never specifically asked for letters from children. There are alternative forms of protest from schools also in the archives, from petitions, which I'll be talking about later in this paper, to letters from head teachers or other staff members on behalf of the whole school. So why did these 4 schools choose to get their students to write letters? Letter writing as protest or petition has a long and well-documented history and is still today seen as an acceptable way for a member of the public to engage in democracy. Indeed, who hasn't been entreated to write a letter or more recently an email to their MP in order to gain support for a particular cause? Letter writing has also long been an important skill taught in primary schools in the UK. Perhaps the proposed closure of the Museum of Childhood provided teachers at these schools an opportunity to not only teach children about a socially accepted form of protest, but also gave them an opportunity to practice their literacy skills. What does the fact that this was likely a teaching exercise say about the extent to which children were engaged with the cause they were protesting in aid of? It is unclear whether this was an optional exercise, but I somehow doubt any of the children were given the choice to opt out of further developing their literacy skills or indeed their citizenship skills. But does that mean that they weren't engaged with the cause or felt strongly about saving the museum? Interestingly, one of the letters notes that the child had also heard about the proposed closure on the news, showing that this was not an issue which children were only hearing about through their teachers. A critique often levelled at children's involvement in protests is to what extent they can fully understand the cause that they are protesting for or against. A lot of the children seemed to really understand what the letters were for, were maybe well briefed, and discuss not only how much they enjoyed the museum, but also how much they learned from their visit, or at the very least, understand that they are asking for the museums not to be closed down. There were, however, some children who didn't necessarily fully understand the brief. While they mentioned the proposed closure, they are far more interested in entreating Burton to make the model train displays more interactive and, quote, put the trains to work. For them, the two don't necessarily seem linked. They're not asking for the museum to stay open so that the trains could be made more interactive, for example. Undoubtedly, children can't have a full comprehension of the wider economic or political context of government cuts to the civil service, but many have an intimate understanding of what those cuts look like on the ground. Do children need to understand why a government wants to cut funding in order to protest the closure of a much-loved museum? Surely all they need to understand is that it is a museum that they have enjoyed visiting and that they want themselves or others to be able to enjoy it in the future. Letters were an important part of the campaign, but so too were petitions. Hundreds of signatures were gathered by the Museum of Childhood, the local Labour Party, and the Keep Bethnal Green Museum Open campaign group. Something particularly interesting here is that on the Museum of Childhood's own petition form, the first people on the list of who the museum should be kept open for is children. While this might not seem surprising for a museum with childhood in the name, staff at this point in the museum's history were very keen for the museum to be seen as a museum of childhood rather than for children. The director in particular was keen for the Museum of Childhood to be a world-renowned museum for its scholarly contribution to the fields of child history and design history. So why are children the first on the list? While it's important not to deny their agency, particularly in protests, it's not unusual for adults to utilise children to make a point, and as such, an important question to ask here is to what extent was the involvement, or indeed the very idea of children, being weaponised in this campaign? Children are often seen as innocents, and as such, more worthy of protection than adults, and by tying the museum to children, it is perhaps being implied that it is even more worthy of being saved. There is another petition in the Museum of Childhood Archives, one created by an infant school in London, which contains the name of 167 children aged between 3 and 7 who, according to the accompanying letter by a member of school staff, quote, may never be able to see the marvellous exhibits, and that would be a tragedy. A staff member also writes in her accompanying note, quote, please pass this on to whoever it may concern and beg them not to enforce the closure for all our sakes, our children's sakes, and the many generations of children still to come. Again, there's an emphasis on safeguarding the museum, but not only for children, but all future children too. And unfortunately, I couldn't find a way to show you this without it being a data protection or ethical issue, but it's very clear from the handwriting that the children did not write their own names. There is enough variation in the handwriting to suggest that it was the children's caregivers who had signed the petition on their behalf, rather than a teacher writing them en masse. But this still raises some interesting questions about individual agency and even consent. We can't know if any or all the children consented to having their names signed on the petition, and one really can, without insulting their agency or intelligence, question to what extent a 3-year-old is capable of giving informed consent for something like this. While we might question the extent to which children understood the nuance of the situation their names have been linked to, there is no guarantee that their parents necessarily took the time to fully understand the wider context of what they were signing their child's name to either. We regularly ask adults to sign change.org petitions with limited information of the wider issues, often forwarded on by passionate parties to friends and family members who will sign simply because they were asked to. Why then do we question children's level of understanding so much more? Something interesting about this petition is that it's kept in the file marked Children, Letters From, rather than with all the other petitions. Why is this the case? Again, we can't know, but perhaps it's because they thought all of the stuff from children should be kept together. But if that's the case, why? Did they see the child petitions as less important or valid than the other petitions? Or did they want to show the support of children en masse, furthering this idea of weaponising innocence? The Museum of Childhood's fierce fight for reprieve was won in August 1982, when Channon bowed to public pressure and announced that the government would not be pursuing Rayner's recommendations to close the Museum of Childhood. But if children were used to further convince Channon to keep the museum open, their contributions were soon forgotten in the reporting of the campaign's ultimate success. The success of the campaign is variously attributed to the Museum of Childhood's director and wider staff, the local people, including a local paper which had been heavily involved in the campaign, the local Labour Party, and a homogenised general public. Children are mentioned in newspaper reports only in the context of it being their museum, as you can see from the headline on the lower left corner of this collage, which you can see in the Museum of Chartered Archives. Children and their attempts to help the campaign were clearly utilised, but they were not necessarily credited. So, to conclude, the role of children within the campaign to save the Museum of Childhood raises some important questions about children's individual agency within protests, but also how they can be weaponised by adults within campaigns. I hope that I have shown that one does not necessarily negate the other, and instead, this is a murky grey area where children can be both willing participants and pawns in protest campaigns. It is also important, however, to question why we are so inclined to second-guess children's abilities to understand what it is that they're protesting and what this says about our views of children within protests. So while we can ask whether these letters were a classroom activity imposed on the children who wrote them, we can also ask to what extent that actually matters when we talk about children's individual engagement with the campaign to save the museum that they all clearly enjoyed visiting. Obviously, there is only so much that we can learn from archival sources, so if anyone watching was in any way involved in the campaign to save the Museum of Childhood, or if you just visited the museum as a child and want to tell me about it, you can help with my research by filling in my short survey. It should only take about 10 minutes and can be found at the address on the screen. Thank you for listening.